Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week I'm joined by Lyndon Frearson. Lyndon specialises in delivering innovation solutions for remote area infrastructure with a focus on complex projects like standalone power systems and renewable energy. Lyndon, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, look, thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so you've obviously given a little bit of background to me. I was trained as an electrical engineer in Melbourne in Australia. I studied power systems and control theory and then didn't quite know what I wanted to do with myself, but ended up getting a job at Ford Motor Company. Was only applied for one graduate program, and I applied for that one because it was the hardest one to get into, and I figured, well, that way, if I didn't get into it, I could explain to my grandmother that I'd tried, but it was too hard, and then I could go off and do my own thing. And my plan at that stage had been to continue running my own business, which I'd started in my second year of uni, and that was actually doing production, lighting, and sound for large outdoor music festivals and concerts, which I really enjoyed doing. I didn't make a lot of money out of it, and actually made most of my money fixing audio equipment and lighting equipment in schools and churches, and the live concert stuff was just a lot of fun. But I applied for Ford and was very fortunate to get one of 15 graduate engineering positions, and having received it somewhat unexpectedly, chose to go to Geelong, which is it was the harder part of Ford to go to. It wasn't the popular place to go to because it was where they had the casting plants and the stamping plants. So it's sort of the heaviest part of the engineering and the dirtiest part. And I quite liked the idea of going there because I didn't have to wear a suit or didn't have to wear shiny shoes, and they gave you your own set of blueies at the time. We didn't have high vis back then, but got to have. Didn't have to dress up and preen in front of everyone. I got my steel caps, and I was working in the biggest workshop that I'd ever seen in my life. It was the biggest shed that I'd ever been part of, and got to learn and work with an amazing group of people. And that really changed my view of what engineering was and what a career could actually be. And it really cemented in my mind some powerful lessons around the importance of listening and deeply understanding the context in which people work and operate, and that the assumptions that you bring as an engineer around what the right solution is and should be are so often inadequate in delivering the right outcome for the people you're actually working with, because it's not until you understand their context and their motivating factors and what's driving them that you really start to understand somewhat counterintuitively what the right engineering solution should be. And that sort of led, I had a great time there, and chose deliberately to not follow a standard career path with Ford. I chose to stay in jobs longer than graduates normally would, but because I loved the engineering, and I loved the opportunity that existed on the shop floor. But after a few years, my wife was given the opportunity to work up in Northern Territory, which is a very remote part of Australia. And we decided that if we didn't go then, we'd never get to go. So I, again, somewhat inconsistent with what the standard graduate career path at Ford was, I took a year's leave without pay and went to Central Australia. And there was one job for an electrical engineer on a project called Bushlight, which was about delivering power systems ultimately to around 250 remote communities across Northern Australia. And I rang them and said, look, I don't know anything about renewable energy, and I don't know anything about remote Aboriginal communities, but I know a lot about how to make volts and amps work in really harsh environments, and particularly with people with either low literacy and numeracy or from differing cultural backgrounds, because on the shop floor there was lots of migrants and lots of people who were using complicated machinery that didn't necessarily have training in that area. And so they offered me the opportunity, and fairly quickly I sort of worked with the general manager of the project at the time and started to craft a technical strategy for them that would allow them to set that project and program up over a number of years and really reframe how they would move from being, I guess, what it was initially a research project and actually move it into a delivery project. And so I did that and ended up spending about 18 months on that, and then went back to Ford this time in Broadmeadows, continued working my way up the ladder there, and again learning a lot and probably reinforcing a lot of those lessons around understanding context and how it drives, and looking for the deeper story and the deeper context behind a problem. And then, but I couldn't quite shake the itch of that experience of working in those really remote locations, and along the way continued to talk with the people that I'd been working with in Alice Springs, and we conceived of this idea of what a wholly Indigenous owned and wholly not-for-profit owned for-profit consultancy that's based in Central Australia but works around Australia and internationally, that takes this idea of using context as a driver of engineering decision-making. How could we make that work? And I went home to my then quite pregnant wife and said, how do you feel about giving up a certain career and certain life trajectory that we had with Ford, moving back to Central Australia and taking a complete, just gamble on whether or not we could make this idea work. And at that point, I had 1 year's job security. We had enough cash to keep me going for a year to see whether we could make this work. And we were fortunate enough that we were able to make it viable from within the first year, and we're coming up to our 18th year of operation now. And as a business, we work all around. We still have offices, our main office in Alice Springs in Central Australia. We've got an office in Hobart, office in Albury. These places don't probably mean anything to you, but they're all regional locations. But we've worked on projects from some of the smallest power systems on some of the smallest islands in the Pacific to right now we've got a principal role advising on the largest transmission network upgrade project in Australia's history, where we're actually helping craft the strategy around how to solve some of the peculiar challenges that exist around connecting large amounts of generation. And we've worked everywhere from Kenya to the Cook Islands, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Philippines. We're working on remote islands in Micronesia at the moment, and working on water projects across Northern Australia. But that common theme of trying to understand in a complex and constrained environment, how do you solve technical challenges where you allow yourself to be informed by the context and the particular story that exists behind what you're actually trying to do. So that's the short summary of what I've been doing.
But that sounds amazing. But what made you go into the workshop rather than take a traditional route into the office when you were...
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I think much of my career has been, when I reflect back on it, has been the road less travelled. And I don't always know exactly why I chose those things. So I was a terrible student at Melbourne Uni. So Melbourne University is one of the group sort of top 8 universities in Australia. It's they call it one of the sandstone universities. So it's not quite as old as other places, but old for Australia. And my mum was a maths tutor there. My dad had done his MBA there. My uncle and auntie had both done their degrees there. My mum had done her science degree there. Like, there was this long history of going to Melbourne. So when I was growing up, there was a fairly high expectation that I would go to Melbourne University. And from my earliest memories, I had family members saying, well, you should be an engineer. But I didn't really know what that was like. And going through school, it was, oh, well, you're good at maths and science. If you're really good at maths and science, you should be a doctor. if you're really good at maths and science and you're good at English and you get a good enough marks, you should be a lawyer. But if you don't get good enough marks, you should do engineering. Like that's the hierarchy: doctor, lawyer, and then engineering was the way that's the way the career counsellors thought about it. And so I got into engineering, but I struggled, and I struggled partly. I just was not a very good student. I was enthusiastic about all the other things that university life can offer. But I also struggled because I was surrounded by people who were really, really smart and really capable. And I just didn't feel like I belonged. Didn't feel like where I needed to be. And so I meandered my way through uni. I was asked by the Dean of Engineering at the Academic Review Board, which I had to attend a couple of times because I had a slightly different view of an appropriate level of progress through engineering than what the university had. And he asked me, why are you here? And I gave him the same story I'm giving you now. And he said, look, I don't, everyone keeps telling me I should be an engineer. All I know is by the time I was 16, I could pull apart and rebuild the gearbox Massey Ferguson tractor. That I love doing live sound and audio and love doing like I love playing with all this stuff. But the theoretical part of engineering was just, I couldn't connect that to what I thought I was good at. And so I ended up going and I took a period of time away from engineering at university. I went and studied postmodern literature and creative writing and a little bit of medieval history and microeconomics and macroeconomics and a whole range of different things, and then came back to engineering and sort of muddled my way through. But the highest marks I ever got for a subject was a subject, oddly enough, it was was an electronics engineering subject. It was one of the mandatory ones you had to do. And for the first time, the questions in the assignment and the questions in the exam were not binary in the sense that you had to provide the right like they would solve this equation and you have to just solve the equation. There's one right answer. And I distinctly remember there was a question on the exam around if you needed to build an amplifier for a guitar, what type of amplifier? And there's in electronics, there's 4 basic amplifier designs that you can choose, A, B, C, or D. And a lot of people really struggled with the question because there is no right answer. Depends on what you're trying to do. And you can make a solid argument for any one of the 4 designs that you're putting up there. And I realized that for the first time, and it was the first time that really clicked, that engineering was not purely an applied science where you just had to try and work out how to make the formula work. And particularly electrical engineering, where so much of it is very ephemeral. It's you can't imagine a bridge or you can't imagine pipes, and like it's all quite esoteric. It was that first time where it didn't matter what the answer was. What mattered was whether you understood enough to be able to justify why you were choosing that particular design. And that was that first moment of going, there's a creative element to engineering. There's a creative element that gives you, it's not about the right answer. It's about solving within the context and the bounds of what the constraints that are being put on you. And that started to really inform my thinking of going, what I want to do is I want to solve problems and I want to create stuff. And so when we were given the opportunity to work at Ford, choosing Geelong and choosing the big factory, the heavy industry part of it was convenient because it was reasonably close to where Rach and I were living at the time. But a lot more of it was that what I wanted to do was to be hands-on in solving the problems. I wanted what I loved was that being in an environment where this is broken, we need to fix it. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough money. What's the solution? How do we come up with it? And that solving problems in a constrained environment was something that I started to really recognise was the thing that I loved doing. And I don't think it's only when I look back at it in retrospect that I can see how I was thinking about it. And I probably didn't have the language at the time to describe that. But that was what drew me into it, was that it was a really clarifying focus around solving problems. And I think that has then the opportunities where as a graduate, most people change jobs every 6 months. And I was asked, just because a person had retired and there had been some other changes of personnel, I was asked to stay on longer, but it would allow me to work more deeply into some projects. And I was warned that, hey, this might damage your career because graduates expected to move around. But I got that sense that just delving deeper into the complexities of solving problems in a constrained environment and delivering big projects where there's always pressure on time, there's always pressure on budget, but you still have an expectation around how to get the end, that there was a lot of value in seeing that all the way through. And I was fortunate to be able to stay on some really tricky projects that I still look back on and go, that was so formative to the way that I started to think about how you approach problems.
Okay, that's interesting. I've also taken a career that's less travelled. Do you think that that's quite an important?
I think if everyone took the road less travelled, it would no longer be the road less travelled. It's not necessarily the right path for some people. And there are people that I admire very greatly who have followed a very traditional route and been enormously successful in what they've been able to do. And I look at them sometimes and think, gee, I admire the fact that you've been able to pursue that path. I guess the advice that I would give to people would be to, before you start following that very defined career path, ask yourself why. Why is it that is the right path for you? And be willing to risk, particularly early on in your career, be willing to risk trying something different, not because anyone else said, but because you're enthusiastic and you're interested. And I reflect now that I'm so grateful that Rach, my wife at the time, she'd always said to me, look, I don't really care what you do as long as you're enjoying it. Because there's nothing worse than doing a job and then coming home and bitching about it all night. And so that, using that opportunity, and then the advice that I had from some early career mentors when I was at Ford around learning, using the early part of your career just to learn and absorb knowledge. And I think that rather than trying to work out how fast you could move to the next step, which frankly, when I sort of started at Ford as the graduate program, the first week we were all together, all the graduates together, the president of the company comes in and we're all the future leaders of the company. You're all the future presidents. You've got to work together and aspire to leadership, blah, blah. And so a lot of the grads just kept looking at what is going to get me to the next spot, and rather than working out what can I learn from where I am. And I just spent a lot of time being really curious. And I think that I was giving a speech recently to a bunch of young engineers, and the three things that I learned most out of that period of time was, first, just read a lot. Just be really, really curious in whatever you're doing, particularly at that sort of first 5 to 10 years of your career. Be intensely curious. Even if it's not in your specialty, just keep asking why. Why does that particular part of the business run that way? Go and find out. Just read, absorb information, because you never know where all those little bits of information will come back and be of value later on. I think the second one was the immense value of building relationships, not networks. And I find now that grads will be hitting me up on LinkedIn as soon as they've got out of, maybe before they're out of uni, they're trying to set up their LinkedIn profiles and get sorted through that. But the value that comes from building relationship, and I spent a lot of time in those early years at Ford, just spending time talking to people and understanding their story, understanding their background, understanding how they got to where they got. Go and spend some time with that 45-year, that grizzled maintenance manager who's been in the factory for 45 years. Get the stories. What there's so much knowledge in people's brains that isn't even formulated, but you only hear about because you build a relationship to get their stories. And the last point was, I learnt the power of saying yes. As long as it doesn't damage your integrity, if someone asks you to do something, just say yes. And I reflect now on the number of different things that have occurred in my life and projects that I've got involved in where someone said, hey, could you do this? And it wasn't my job, and it wasn't technically within my strict definition of what I wanted to do and what my preferred skill set was. But I could do it, and I was available, and it didn't damage my integrity. And so I said yes. And suddenly you find yourself in a world where you're invited into meetings that you never thought you'd be involved in because someone heard you say yes and thought, oh, well, you're good at that stuff. Can you come along and join this? So I think for me, that was that experience that I had in those early years and those that it was such an amazing training ground, but those lessons have continued to stick with me. And I think that it's actually perhaps not so much about the path less traveled, but more so about maintaining curiosity, building relationships, and always being willing to say yes and just seeing where it goes. And if you can do that, I think that's where there's an awful lot of fun to be had in your career.
I think so too. Do you think it's quite important to take risks in your early career rather than maybe take a risk here and there later on?
Look, I think there's a lot of pressure, particularly when you in many of those graduate programs, to work out how fast you can move up the ladder, and there's who can get to senior management by the time they're 30, who can get to that level faster than anyone's got there before. And ambition is a good thing, and it can be a great motivator of activity. But the reality is that first 5 or 10 years of your career, there's such immense opportunity to take risk and learn and recover. And at the time, it seems horrendously daunting, the idea that you'd step away from something and then you won't be able to get back onto that ladder. But the reality is as you'd know, once you've been doing it for 20 odd years, 1 year away from it seems like a very small thing. And the practical reality is at my point now, you have mortgages and children and partners and you've got staff that depend on you. The reality is that the ability to take those major risks at this later stage, it's just harder. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but it's just harder. And so I'd always encourage people to use those early parts of their career to really step out and do something and understand what their purpose is. And I think that for me was I was fortunate that I was given the opportunity to take those risks. I was fortunate that I had people who were willing to support me and encourage me to some extent. But it helped me understand over time my purpose as a professional, and getting, the faster you can work out your purpose, the better. And determining your purpose is far more important than attaining a role, because in determining your purpose and determining what makes you tick, you'll get far higher degrees of contentment in your work, and you're likely to be far more successful in what you do because you'll understand why you're there, rather than waking up one day and going, how did I end up here? This is not the career. This is not what I wanted to be doing. And unfortunately, I do know quite a few people who they've spent 15, 20 years climbing a ladder and then suddenly get there and go, I'm actually not sure I want to be here. But the costs of changing at that point can be quite considerably higher. And so using that time to determine your purpose, I think, is really important.
Yeah, but that is important. That, I agree, it is really important. But how would you, or I would say, what advice would you give a young graduate on how to find their purpose? Because it is difficult, even for us older ones.
Yeah, like I think, well, I guess I'd go back to those three things I said before is you finished your university, great. But now your job now is to learn. Everyone knows that you're smart. You've got through a university degree, that's great. We know that you can do that. Your job now is to learn. And that goes back to that being intensely curious. Learn, absorb knowledge, absorb context, continue, just constantly ask yourself why. And then in asking yourself why, pursue why is it that people do stuff, whether if you're working with clients, why are clients motivated to do something? Understand their business. Don't just do what you've been asked to do. Take the effort, even if it means sitting at home late at night researching why is it that the client wants this. Because the more you learn about that, in the process of learning those things and understanding the context of others, the more you learn about yourself. And I think that would be the thing, is building that intense curiosity early in your career, and then building those sets of relationships with people who'll be able to help you do that. And it may be that your personal purpose is harder to narrow down, but I've never been disappointed by building a relationship. I've never been and investing into relationships with people. I've never been disappointed by asking myself why and showing some curiosity. And I've never been disappointed by saying yes. And I think that they become very powerful ways of framing the opportunity that sits in front of you early in your career.
Okay, but then say if you maybe in your early career didn't really want to go and follow the management route, and then maybe halfway through you decided that that's the path you now want to take. Do you think it's still achievable to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the challenges, and many of us would have seen this within large organisations, is that often for engineers, the only way of progression through an organisation is to move into management. So the only way to enhance your salary and to move the ladder is to go into management. And the reality is there's a lot of very good engineers who should not be in management positions. There's also some really good organisational leaders who aren't engineers but should be in leadership positions because they get how to do that. If someone has worked out that they're not in management and they would like to be, the first question I would say is why? What is motivating that change? I think the second, if in understanding that, I think there's quite often the reason for wanting that management position is because you've been around long enough and you've seen stuff being messed up long enough that you want to get in there and influence that change yourself. Now, it is harder to do that later in your career cycle within the same organisation, because often there's quite structured progression. But where I've seen people do that successfully is where they've stepped out and demonstrated that they can show that leadership, and I use that word very explicitly, leadership as opposed to management, that they can demonstrate that leadership in a adjacent technology or adjacent industry. And then having demonstrated in that adjacent industry can come back and effectively leapfrog up because they've been able to show that they can do something that many people can't, which is to learn outside of the boundaries of their discipline. And one of the challenges that I think some engineers who move into management have is that they know their subject matter really well, but they know their subject matter from inside the subject. They don't necessarily know it in the context in which their subject matter exists. And a big part of leadership and a big part of management as you work through into sort of increasing levels of influence is being able to contextualize how do all these different pieces fit together. I was spending some time with a senior engineer and sort of counselling them on some. They were struggling with how do they get someone to understand the size of the problem they were dealing with, and why weren't people listening. And I think the challenge is that as engineers, we can often think, well, we've done the hard work. We know what the right answer is, but it's not enough to be right. And that can be really frustrating for a lot of engineers and especially people who've had quite a lot of experience. It's not enough to be right. It matters not just being right, but how you then get other people to believe you're right. And in that requires a certain degree of humility and vulnerability to be able to say, well, it's not just because I know what the right answer is. Actually, I've got to get other people to believe and come on board with this, which means that I need to understand their motivations. I need to understand what's driving their behaviours and thinking. In doing that, you then start to say, well, it's not actually about my view of what's right. It's about how other people take on board that idea and take ownership of it. I think for people who have sort of gone down a path and decide they want to change career, moving into that adjacent industry and even potentially taking a slight step back, but in doing so gives them such a powerful perspective of the context in which they are operating, because for the first time, they're now sitting outside looking back at what they were doing, and they can start to see that, hang on, there was stuff moving around them that they couldn't always see. There's a leadership paradigm that I was taught quite some time ago, the idea that very often we're on a dance floor and we're in a dance and we're all spinning around and we're interacting with the people that's there. But if you then go and stand up on the balcony and look down and you see how everyone's moving and meshing and how the dance working, but you can't see it when you're on the ground. And so taking that adjacent step or taking that sideways step into an adjacent industry where you can, for the first time, perhaps look up, be on the balcony looking back at what you were doing, or looking down at what you were doing, then I think prepares you to be able to go back in and add immense value, because you're now not just a specialist, but you have context, and context drives your understanding then of how to have influence and opportunity.
Okay, but it is still achievable then.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's some of the most impressive organizational leaders and individuals that I've worked with are people who have made quite substantive changes to their career along the way and have zigzagged at different points rather than just following through a path. And I think what makes them great leaders is that, and great influencers in their particular sectors, and has allowed them to move up those career trajectories, is that they bring those different perspectives and they've been willing to learn more along the way.
Yeah, I agree as well. So do you think that maybe traveling abroad or traveling to a different area is going to help your
Yeah,
career?
look, I think I'm always an enthusiastic. I love travel and I love the opportunities from there. I think the one thing I'd say about travel is that, and working abroad, is it can be like everything. It's only as useful as what you're willing to invest into that. I probably used to have sort of slightly sort of flawed view of international work and you're gallivanting around the world and globetrotting and all the rest of it. But the reality is the greatest benefit I've got of working internationally is the same benefit that I've got working in really remote projects around Australia and elsewhere, is learning how context drives behaviour. That context, the different context in which people live means that the solutions that we think might necessarily be the best ones often don't work, because you need to understand what is driving and framing the way that people live, work, behave, thrive and survive in the environments in which they operate. And so that opportunity to travel is a great one, but you can also get some of that benefit from just by moving around the country, moving to other areas as long as you're willing to keep asking yourself, what's motivating and driving the way people work here, because it's different. Why does it work that way? And I guess I go back to that idea, that curiosity around what's the underlying factor here? What's the story behind the story that's influencing how people work and operate in this way? And in doing so, I'll be able to learn more about what the right or what the most appropriate solutions will actually be in the future.
Okay, that's interesting. So, what advice would you give to any young graduate that's going away to enter into their first job?
I'd probably go back to that thing that I said before, is this is your first job. Your first job is an amazing opportunity to learn. And in fact, your second job and your third job probably are as well. But your job isn't to be an expert. Your job isn't to be a specialist at that point. Your job, above all else, is to learn how things work and how whatever engineering discipline you have, how does it work within that context? I think the second thing I'd say is, in learning how you do that, and that goes to that curiosity piece, would be, don't ever underestimate the value of the stories that other people have. That first day that I arrived at Ford, I had a grizzled old maintenance supervisor come down, and he used a set of language that I can't repeat in this particular context, but he put his arm around me, and he walked me down the aisles of the plant, and massive machines, and it's noisy and it's hot, and earmuffs on, and I could still hear his voice just pounding through the earmuffs and stuff. And he said to me, "Listen here, Frearson, I don't care what those F's up in head office told you you're going to be. If you don't listen to me, I'll effing destroy you. But if you listen to me, I'll make something of you." And what that was, I was a little bit scared at the time, but what was really important was, he had 45 years of graduates coming in telling him that they'd been to university and they knew what they needed to know, and that they were only there for as short as possible time until they could move the next stop. But once I took what he said to heart, and I spent a lot of time talking to him, understanding why did he run the maintenance the way he did? Why did he do this? You start to realize there's such a rich vein of knowledge that exists by people who live on the tools, who work day in, day out in the environment. And as engineers, we often sort of fly in, look at a problem, solve it, and then move on. And when we do that, we miss the richness of the knowledge that exists in the context that we work. And I'd say to a young graduate, find those people. Every organisation, every workplace has got those people who just carry that richness of knowledge, that richness of understanding, and they may be the least expected. It might be the finance officer who's just been around forever and has seen all the different fads going through an organisation, but they can tell you that history around why things have got to be where they got to be. It could be a maintenance worker, it could be a boiler maker, it could be the executive assistant who's been the executive assistant to the last 10 CEOs or 10 senior managers who's just been there for so many years. Tell me the stories of what you've seen. And there's so much knowledge, there's so much experience that's embedded in the people around which, and sometimes as engineers, we let our knowledge and our thought about getting to the right solution gets in the way of hearing that deeper story. And therefore, sometimes what we produce is not really the best outcome.
That's excellent advice. That is excellent advice. So I'm going to maybe wrap up there, actually, and leave on that really positive note. So that's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Lyndon for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening, and see you next week. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.